Sometimes the truth doesn't knock. It waits for something that can hear it first. The first time Rex stopped in the middle of the cabin, Daniel Hayes didn't think much of it. The old wooden floor creaked under his boots as usual, the kind of tired sound you'd expect from a place that had been standing longer than anyone cared to remember. And outside, the wind moved slowly through the pine trees like it had all the time in the world, carrying that dry, cold scent of mountain air that settled deep in your lungs. Daniel had bought the cabin for less than the cost of a used pickup tire, sight unseen. Just a listing someone forgot to take down, and that alone should have told him something wasn't right. But he wasn't looking for perfect, he was looking for quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't ask questions, didn't remind him of things he couldn't fix anymore. Rex stood still near the center of the room, ears lifted, body tense but not afraid, just focused. Like he used to get back when they were overseas, and something invisible shifted in the air before anyone else noticed, and Daniel leaned against the doorframe watching him, arms folded, waiting for the moment to pass. Because sometimes dogs just heard things people couldn't. Mice in the walls, pipes settling, the small hidden movements of a place trying to hold itself together. But Rex didn't move, not for a long time. And then slowly, almost carefully, he lowered his head and let out a soft sound. Not quite a bark, not quite a whine. Something older, something instinctive, and placed one paw gently against the floorboards as if testing them. Daniel pushed himself upright, boots dragging softly across the wood as he stepped closer, the late afternoon light stretching thin through the narrow window behind him, dust drifting in the air like it had nowhere else to go. And for a moment, he just stood there beside the dog, listening. Though there was nothing to hear, not really, just the low breath of wind slipping through the cracks of the cabin and the distant rustle of branches brushing against each other. "You hear something, boy?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying that rough edge of a man who didn't use it much anymore. But Rex didn't look at him, didn't wag his tail, didn't break focus. He simply pressed his paw a little firmer against the same spot. And then it came, 3 sharp barks, controlled, deliberate, spaced just enough apart to feel like a pattern instead of noise. And Daniel felt something tighten in his chest before he even understood why, because he had heard that exact rhythm before. Not here, not in a quiet mountain cabin, but somewhere far away, somewhere loud and dangerous, where that pattern meant one thing and one thing only. Pay attention. He crouched slowly, placing his hand flat against the floor where Rex had been pressing, the wood cool under his palm, worn smooth in some places and rough in others. And at first, there was nothing, just solid ground like it should be. But then he shifted slightly, fingers spreading, pressing harder, and the sound changed, faint, hollow, almost too subtle to notice unless you were looking for it. A quiet difference that didn't belong in a cabin built on rock and earth. Rex stepped back just enough to give him space. But his eyes never left that spot, amber and steady, as if whatever lay beneath those boards had been waiting longer than either of them could understand. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath fogging faintly in the cooling air, and for the first time since he'd arrived, the silence in the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, like the place itself was holding on to something it hadn't decided to let go of yet. And he realized then that maybe he hadn't bought this cabin just because it was cheap. Maybe something about it had found him first, something quiet, something patient, something that didn't need to shout to be heard, because it already had Rex listening. Daniel did not move his hand right away, as if lifting it too soon might break whatever fragile truth was beginning to surface beneath the floor. And for a long moment, he simply stayed there, palm pressed flat against the wood while Rex stood beside him, silent now, watching with the steady patience of something that had already made its decision. The air in the cabin felt different, not colder exactly, but heavier, as though the space itself had drawn a slow breath and was holding it, waiting for him to do the same. And Daniel shifted his weight slightly, pressing again, listening more carefully this time, not just with his ears, but with that quiet instinct he had learned to trust in places where hesitation cost more than time. There it was again, faint but certain, that hollow response beneath the boards, not wide, not obvious, just enough to suggest that something had been placed there deliberately, something meant to be hidden rather than forgotten. He leaned back onto his heels, running a hand through his hair as he glanced around the cabin, taking in the rough stone fireplace, the narrow window, the sagging beams above. all of it worn but intact, nothing about it suggesting a secret beneath his feet. And yet Rex had not moved, not even an inch, his gaze fixed, ears forward, body still as if anchored to that exact point in the room. "All right," Daniel murmured, more to himself than to the dog, his voice low and steady. "Let us see what you are hearing." And he stood slowly, boots scraping against the floor as he crossed to his pack near the wall, pulling out a small pry bar he had carried for years without much thought. One of those tools that stayed with a man long after he stopped needing it every day. When he returned, Rex stepped back just enough to give him space. But the dog's presence remained close, watchful, like a partner who understood the stakes even when the situation made no sense. Daniel crouched again, sliding the thin edge of the bar into the narrow seam between two boards, testing the resistance, careful not to force anything too quickly, because Oldwood had a way of breaking when pushed the wrong way, and he did not yet know what lay beneath or how fragile it might be. The first attempt gave him nothing but a dull scrape, the board holding firm, but the second time he adjusted the angle, pressing a little deeper, and this time there was a subtle shift, a soft creak that seemed to echo longer than it should have, as if the sound had somewhere else to go. He paused, listening, and in that silence he became aware of something else, something he had not noticed before, a faint vibration under his hand, so slight it might have been imagined, except that Rex reacted to it instantly, his head tilting, ears tightening, a low breath leaving his chest as though he recognized the pattern. Daniel froze, counting without thinking, the way he used to when time mattered, 1, 2, 3, and then it came again, that same subtle tremor, steady, spaced, almost rhythmic, and something about it felt wrong, not natural, not random, but intentional in a way he could not yet explain. He exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on the pry bar as he worked it deeper into the seam, and this time when he pulled, the board lifted just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness beneath, a narrow gap that swallowed the fading light from the window. And for a moment neither man nor dog moved, both of them staring into that small opening as if it might look back. The cabin remained silent around them, the wind outside brushing softly against the walls, but inside, something had changed. Something had shifted from hidden to waiting, and Daniel realized that whatever lay beneath that floor had not been discovered by accident. It had been found because something, or someone, had chosen the right moment to be heard. Daniel held the board in place for a second longer before pulling it free, the old wood resisting with a tired groan as it finally gave way, and a thin cloud of dust rose into the air, catching what little light remained in the room as if it had been waiting years for that moment to be disturbed. Beneath it, the darkness was deeper than it should have been, not just a shallow crawl space or a forgotten gap between beams, but something that seemed to stretch downward, swallowing the light in a way that made it hard to judge depth. And he leaned closer, steadying himself with one hand on the floor as his eyes adjusted slowly. Rex moved in beside him, careful, controlled, lowering his head just enough to peer into the opening without crossing the edge, his ears shifting slightly, as though tracking something that did not make a sound, and Daniel could feel the dog's tension, not fear exactly, but recognition. The same kind of alertness that used to pass between them without words. "Easy," Daniel murmured, though the word was meant as much for himself as it was for Rex, and he reached back to grab the flashlight from his pack, clicking it on with a soft snap that echoed faintly in the stillness. The beam cut through the darkness, narrow and steady, revealing rough wooden edges framing the opening, and, just below, a set of steps carved into the earth itself, not clean or recent, but worn, smoothed by time and use, descending at a slight angle into the unseen. He paused, the light lingering on the first step, tracing the grain of the wood where it met packed dirt, and something about it felt deliberate, not improvised, as if whoever built it had intended for it to last. Rex let out a quiet breath, stepping back once before moving forward again, pacing a small circle as if weighing a decision, then returning to the edge and sitting down firmly, his gaze locked on the opening, his body language clear in a way that needed no translation. Daniel swallowed slowly, the air in the cabin now carrying a faint metallic tang he could not place, subtle but present, and he found himself listening again, waiting for that vibration to return, that steady pulse he had felt through the floor. But for the moment, there was nothing, Only silence layered on silence, the kind that pressed in rather than opened up. He shifted his grip on the flashlight, angling the beam deeper, watching as it slid along the narrow staircase and disappeared into a darker stretch below. And then something caught the edge of the light, just for a second, a faint reflection, dull and metallic, far enough down that he could not make out its shape. His breath slowed as his mind began to connect pieces he did not fully understand. The hidden entrance, the deliberate construction, the rhythmic vibration, none of it random, none of it accidental, and certainly not something left behind without reason. Rex stood again, stepping closer this time, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's arm, a quiet gesture that carried more weight than any command, and Daniel rested his hand briefly on the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth there, grounding himself in something real before he made the next choice. He glanced once around the cabin, at the fading light, the walls that had seemed empty only hours before, and then back to the opening at his feet, and without another word, he shifted forward, placing one boot carefully onto the first step, testing its strength, feeling the solid give of something built to hold weight. And as he began to lower himself into the narrow descent, the light above seemed to pull away faster than it should have, leaving him with the growing sense that he was not just going down into the earth, but into something that had been waiting a very long time to be found. The air grew cooler with each step Daniel took, not the natural chill of earth or stone, but a stillness that felt sealed off from the world above, as though the space below the cabin had been holding its own time for years without interruption. And he moved carefully, one boot at a time, testing each worn step before shifting his weight, the beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow path ahead while the rest of the darkness remained untouched behind him. Rex followed without hesitation, his movements quieter than usual, measured, his nails barely making a sound against the wood, as if even he understood that this place demanded something different, something slower. The staircase continued longer than Daniel expected, more than a simple basement would require, angling deeper until the wooden steps gave way to packed earth, and then to a flat surface that felt solid beneath his feet. And when he reached the bottom, he paused, turning slightly to sweep the light across the space. Around him, the beam revealed walls reinforced with old timber supports, aged but sturdy, the kind of construction that spoke of intention rather than convenience, and the floor stretched out farther than the cabin above could account for, forming a low chamber that felt hidden not just physically, but purposefully. The faint metallic scent was stronger here, mixed with something older, something dry and preserved, like paper or fabric that had not been touched in decades. Rex stepped forward. Beside him, nose lifting as he tested the air, then moving slowly along the perimeter, his ears shifting in small, precise movements as though tracking something Daniel could not hear. And for a moment, Daniel simply watched him, trusting that instinct the way he always had, letting the dog guide the rhythm of discovery. The flashlight beam caught on objects gradually. First a wooden crate pushed against the far wall, its surface worn smooth by time, then another beside it, stacked with care rather than abandoned, and beyond them, a narrow table built from rough planks, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust that had settled evenly, undisturbed, as if no one had been there to disturb it for years. Daniel stepped closer, his boots making soft contact with the ground, and reached out with one hand, brushing his fingers lightly across the table, leaving a clean line through the dust that felt almost out of place, like a mark that should not exist yet. He shifted the light again, revealing more details, small items arranged with quiet precision, a metal canteen, a folded piece of cloth, a notebook resting near the edge, its cover faded but intact, and something about the placement of everything felt deliberate, as though whoever had built this space had not intended to return quickly, but had expected it to remain exactly as it was. Rex stopped suddenly near the center of the room, his body going still again, that same focused posture returning as he looked down at the ground, not at the walls or the crates, but at a specific point near the far end where the light barely reached, and Daniel followed his gaze, stepping slowly toward him, each movement measured, controlled, the quiet pressing in around them like a presence rather than an absence. As the beam of light settled over the spot, it revealed a section of the floor that was different from the rest, not just worn, but marked, Faint lines etched into the surface as if something had once been placed there and then carefully removed, leaving behind only the memory of its shape. Daniel felt that same subtle tension return to his chest, the sense that they were not at the end of something, but at the beginning of it, and Rex lowered his head once more, letting out a soft, almost questioning sound, as if whatever lay hidden in that place was not just buried, but waiting to be understood. Daniel crouched slowly beside the marked section of the floor, the beam of his flashlight narrowing as his hand hovered just above the faint outline, and for a moment he did not touch it, as if some quiet instinct warned him that once he did, something irreversible would begin. Rex remained still at his side, his breathing steady but deeper now, his attention fixed with an intensity that Daniel had only seen in moments when the world shifted without warning, and that alone was enough to push him forward. Carefully, Daniel lowered his hand and brushed his fingers across the surface, feeling the subtle difference in texture where the marks had been left behind, not scratches, not damage, but something more deliberate, like a shape that had once been anchored there and then lifted away with care. He shifted the light closer, angling it so the shallow grooves caught the beam, revealing a rectangular outline just large enough to suggest that something solid had once rested there. Something important enough to be centered in a room built to be hidden. His pulse slowed, not from calm, but from focus, the same narrowing of attention that had carried him through moments where every detail mattered. And he leaned in closer, tracing the edges with his fingertips until he found it, a small indentation near one corner, almost invisible unless you were searching for it. He paused, glancing briefly at Rex, who met his eyes for the first time since they had entered the chamber. And in that silent exchange there was no fear, only a quiet certainty, as if the dog already understood what came next. Daniel pressed his fingers into the indentation and felt a slight give beneath the surface. Not much, just enough to confirm that the ground here was not as solid as it appeared, and he shifted his weight, applying more pressure, testing the mechanism without forcing it, because whatever this was, it had been built to remain hidden, not to be broken open. For a second, nothing happened, and then, with a soft, almost reluctant sound, the section beneath his hand shifted, the edges loosening just enough to reveal a narrow seam running along the outline he had traced. Rex stepped back immediately, not in alarm, but in anticipation, his body lowering slightly, as if bracing for something unseen, and Daniel felt that same quiet tension rise in his chest again, stronger now, sharper, as though the air itself had begun to change. He repositioned the pry bar in his hand, sliding it carefully into the seam, working it deeper until he felt it catch against something solid beneath, and then he pulled, slowly at first, the resistance firm but not immovable, like a door that had not been opened in a very long time. The surface lifted just enough to reveal darkness beneath, deeper than before, more contained, and as the gap widened, the faint metallic scent grew stronger, carrying with it a sense of age that could not be measured in years alone. Daniel set the flashlight on the ground beside him, angling it so the beam fell into the opening, and what it revealed made him pause, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because this was no natural space, no simple hollow beneath the earth, but something constructed, something sealed with intention, a second layer hidden beneath the first. Rex moved closer again, but this time he did not step forward. He simply sat beside Daniel, his posture calm, his gaze steady, as if whatever lay below was no longer a question, but an answer waiting to be understood, and Daniel realized then that this place had not been built to keep something out, but to keep something in, something preserved, something protected, something that had been waiting not just to be found, but to be revealed at the exact moment someone was willing to listen. Daniel did not rush as he widened the opening, his movements steady and deliberate, because something about the space beneath demanded patience rather than force. And when the hidden panel finally lifted enough to allow a clear view inside, he leaned forward slightly, resting one hand against the edge while the flashlight beam slid deeper into the concealed compartment. What it revealed was not chaos or decay, but order. A carefully arranged interior lined with dark wood, smoother and more refined than anything else in the chamber above, as if this inner space had been built with a different purpose, a different level of care. The light caught on the edges of a metal surface, A rectangular container set neatly within the recess. Its finish dulled by time, but still intact, not rusted or abandoned, but preserved in a way that suggested it had been meant to endure. Daniel exhaled slowly. The faint metallic scent now stronger, carrying with it a sense of stillness that felt almost intentional, as though the air inside had not been disturbed since the moment it was sealed. Rex remained beside him, his body calm now, the earlier tension replaced by something quieter, something settled, and he lowered his head slightly, watching as Daniel reached down into the compartment. The metal container was heavier than it looked, its weight solid and grounded as Daniel tested it with both hands, lifting it carefully and setting it on the floor beside the opening. The sound of it meeting the earth soft but distinct in the silence. He brushed his fingers across the surface, tracing the edges, noticing the small details, the clean lines, the absence of corrosion, and then he saw it, faint but unmistakable, an engraving near the corner, worn just enough to be subtle, but clear enough to recognize as intentional. He angled the flashlight closer, narrowing the beam until the markings came into focus, letters etched with precision, not decorative, but official, and something about the shape of them stirred a memory he had not expected, something distant but familiar. Rex shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing against Daniel again, grounding him in the present, and Daniel let his hand rest there for a brief second before returning his attention to the container, his fingers finding the edge of a latch built seamlessly into the design. It did not resist when he tested it, but it did not open freely either, requiring just enough pressure to confirm that it had been sealed with purpose rather than locked away in fear. He paused again, listening, feeling for that subtle vibration that had guided them here, but the ground beneath them remained still. The rhythm gone, as though whatever signal had been sent was no longer needed. The cabin above felt impossibly far away now, separated not just by distance, but by something less tangible, something that made this moment feel contained, almost isolated from the rest of the world. Daniel drew a slow breath, steadying himself, and then, with measured intent, he pressed the latch and felt it give a soft, almost quiet release that echoed faintly in the chamber. The lid shifted just enough to break the seal, and as he began to lift it, the beam of light slipped inside, revealing the first glimpse of what had been hidden away for years, not as something forgotten, but as something waiting for the exact moment it would finally be seen. And Daniel understood then that whatever he was about to uncover was not random, not chance, but part of something that had been set in motion long before he ever stepped foot inside the cabin. The lid opened slowly, not with resistance, but with a quiet weight that suggested it had been waiting rather than locked away. And as Daniel lifted it fully, the beam of the flashlight settled inside, revealing a carefully arranged interior that looked untouched by time, as though the years above had simply passed it by. There was no clutter, no disorder, only a small collection of items placed with intention, each one positioned as if it still held meaning beyond its physical form, and Daniel leaned closer, his breath steady but measured, as his eyes moved from one object to the next. A folded piece of fabric lay along one side, dark and worn but preserved, its edges sharp despite its age, and beside it rested a leather-bound notebook, its cover softened by time yet intact, the surface carrying faint creases that suggested it had once been handled often. Rex shifted slightly behind him, not stepping forward this time, but remaining close, his presence steady, his earlier urgency replaced with a quiet watchfulness that felt almost respectful, as if whatever lay within the container was no longer a mystery to be uncovered, but something to be understood. Daniel reached in slowly, his fingers brushing lightly against the notebook before lifting it out. The leather cool to the touch, heavier than expected, and as he turned it in his hands, he noticed the same engraved marking on the front, subtle but precise, matching the one he had seen on the container itself. He opened it carefully, the spine giving with a soft, dry sound, and the first page revealed handwriting, clean and deliberate, the kind that carried discipline in every line. And for a moment, Daniel simply stared at it, not reading yet, just recognizing something in the shape of the letters, something that stirred a memory he could not quite place. He turned the page slowly, the paper holding its form, not brittle, but preserved, and the words began to form patterns that felt familiar in a way that did not make immediate sense. References to locations, dates, notes written with clarity and purpose, not personal reflections, but records, observations. Something that had been meant to be understood by someone who knew what to look for. Rex let out a soft breath, settling down onto the ground beside him. His body relaxed now, his role shifting from guide to companion. As if his part in the discovery had been completed, Daniel continued turning the pages, each one revealing more of the same careful detail, until he reached a section where the writing changed, not in style, but in tone, becoming more direct, more intentional, and then he saw it. A name written clearly across the top of the page, underlined once, not for emphasis, but for certainty. His hand paused, the flashlight beam steadying as he leaned closer, reading the name again to be sure, and the moment stretched longer than it should have, because the name was not unfamiliar, not distant, but his own, written in the same careful script as everything else in the book, as if it had always belonged there. Daniel did not move right away, his thoughts narrowing into a single quiet line as the realization settled in, not with shock, but with a strange sense of recognition, as though something he had not known he was missing had just been placed back where it belonged. And in that stillness, he understood that this was no longer just a hidden room or a forgotten container, but something far more precise, something that had been prepared, preserved, and left behind not for anyone, but for him, waiting in silence until the moment he was ready to see it. Daniel did not turn the page right away, his eyes fixed on the name as if it might shift or fade if he looked too quickly, but it remained there, steady and certain, written in the same careful hand that had filled every line before it. And he felt something settle deep in his chest, not fear, not confusion, but a quiet recognition that he could not fully explain. Rex remained beside him, calm now, his presence grounded, as if the urgency that had brought them here had given way to something else, something slower, something meant to be taken in rather than rushed. Daniel finally lowered his gaze to the lines beneath the name, his breath steady as he began to read, and the words did not feel random or scattered. They felt directed, structured in a way that suggested they had been written with a clear purpose, as though whoever had left them behind had known exactly who would be reading them. The entries spoke in a tone that was both distant and familiar, referencing events, places, and moments that seemed to mirror fragments of Daniel's own life, not exactly as he remembered them, but close enough to create a sense of alignment that was impossible to ignore, like two paths running side by side, separated by time, yet following the same direction. He turned another page, the paper shifting softly beneath his fingers, and the details became more precise. Dates aligning with years he recognized, locations that matched deployments he had once tried to forget, and yet the writing was older. The ink settled into the page in a way that spoke of decades, not recent memory. A faint breath left him as he leaned closer, the beam of the flashlight steady but narrowing as his focus sharpened, and then he saw it again, not just his name, but references to choices, decisions, moments that had shaped him, written as if they had been observed from a distance, recorded without judgment, only with clarity. Rex shifted slightly, resting his head gently against Daniel's knee, a quiet gesture that carried reassurance rather than urgency, and Daniel placed a hand on the dog's back without looking away from the page, grounding himself in the present as the past seemed to unfold in front of him in a way that did not follow the rules he understood. He turned another page, and this time the writing changed again, becoming more direct, less observational, as if the distance between writer and reader had narrowed, and the words no longer described, but addressed, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that felt intentional, as though the message had been waiting for this exact moment to be understood. The air in the chamber remained still, the earlier vibration gone completely now, replaced by a silence that felt resolved rather than empty. And Daniel realized that whatever signal had drawn them here had fulfilled its purpose, not by revealing everything at once, but by leading him step by step to something that had always been meant for him. He closed the notebook slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding that this was not something to rush through, and as he rested it carefully beside the container, his gaze shifted back to the remaining contents, knowing now that the answers were not hidden in one place, but layered, waiting to be uncovered piece by piece, just as they had been revealed so far. And in that quiet moment, with Rex steady at his side and the weight of the discovery settling around him, Daniel understood that this was no longer just a discovery of something buried beneath a forgotten cabin, but the beginning of something far more personal, something that connected him to a past he had never known existed, and a purpose that had been waiting long before he ever arrived. Daniel remained still for a long moment after closing the notebook, his hand resting lightly on its worn cover, as if he could still feel the weight of the words inside, not just as ink on paper, but as something that had reached across time to find him exactly where he stood, and the silence around him no longer felt empty or uncertain. It felt complete, as though the space beneath the cabin had finished saying what it needed to say. Rex shifted closer, lowering himself fully to the ground. Beside Daniel, his body relaxed now in a way that spoke of resolution rather than alertness, his steady breathing filling the quiet with a sense of calm that had not been there before, and Daniel let his hand rest briefly against the dog's shoulder, grounding himself in something real as his thoughts slowly settled into place. He looked back at the open compartment, at the container, the notebook, the carefully preserved items that had been waiting in darkness for years without decay or disorder, and he realized that none of it had been left behind by accident. None of it had been forgotten. It had all been placed with intention, arranged with purpose, and held in silence until the moment it would be understood. The faint metallic scent that had filled the chamber earlier seemed to fade now, replaced by the more familiar smell of earth and wood, as though the space itself was releasing its hold, no longer needing to remain sealed in the same way it once had, and Daniel rose slowly to his feet, the movement unhurried, his eyes taking in the room one last time before turning back toward the staircase. Rex stood with him without being called, his posture easy, no longer guiding, no longer searching, simply present, and together they moved back toward the steps, the flashlight beam lifting ahead of them as they began the slow ascent. Each step upward felt different from the way down, lighter somehow, as though the weight that had drawn them below had shifted into something else, something quieter and more certain. And when Daniel reached the top and stepped back into the cabin, the air felt warmer, the fading light through the windows softer than before, the space no longer carrying the same emptiness it had when he first arrived. He stood there for a moment, looking across the room at the place where the floor had been opened, now resting slightly ajar, no longer a hidden secret, but a known passage. And Rex walked over to it, sniffing once before. Turning away, his interest gone, his purpose fulfilled, Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face as he took in the stillness around him, the quiet of the cabin now feeling less like isolation and more like something steady, something grounded, and he understood then that whatever had brought him here had not been chance, not just a cheap listing or a need to disappear, but something more deliberate, something that had guided him step by step until he was ready to see what had been waiting. He walked to the window, looking out at the trees standing silent under the fading sky, the wind moving gently through them, carrying no urgency now, only a quiet presence, and behind him, Rex settled onto the floor, resting his head down with a calm that had not been there before. Daniel did not need to open the notebook again to know that what he had found would not disappear. It would remain, not just in pages or hidden rooms, but in the way it had changed something inside him, something subtle but certain. And as he stood there in the quiet of the cabin, he realized that some things are not lost to time. They are simply waiting for the right moment and the right person to listen closely enough to finally